To have this opportunity. My name is Uzi Baram, and I'm a longtime member of Temple Emanu-El. And this is a nice chance for me to pull together two aspects of my life, as well as two aspects of my professional career. As a member of Temple Emanu-El, I've been privileged to be part of a warm, wonderful community. I'm also a professor of anthropology at New College of Florida, and I'll just use the standard disclaimer that nothing I say in this presentation represents New College nor its Board of Trustees. And this is a nice chance for me to bring my research as a professor to my community at Temple Emanu-El, but it also is a chance for me to bring together two parts of my career. I had earlier worked in the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically in Israel, as an archaeologist, looking at a whole series of anthropological issues about ethnic identity and development of nationalism, as well as just being enmeshed in all the wonderful debates that occur there. And this is a chance for you to think about those experiences in light of what was really about a decade and a half of my career involving a group of people who lived for several decades on the Manatee River, not far from where the temple is in Sarasota. And so what I've got the opportunity to do is to, and you see it's long-winded, talk about finding liberty. And I'll be discussing what archaeology finds out about freedom-seeking people in Sinai and Gulf Coast, Florida. And I'm promising this is going to be a quick presentation on recent excavations in Bradenton, Florida. And I'm going to do it as a comparison to the biblical Exodus. It's mostly to highlight the challenges for archaeology when searching for a heritage of freedom. First, the project that's really enmeshed my career. I'll put forward that this project started in 2004 and is asked to join an interdisciplinary research team. And a few years later, Rabbi Glickman in 2007 asked me to speak in April about the project. It had made the newspapers, he was interested in it, and he asked me to come to the Bima one Friday night and to discuss it. And as he might remember, maybe some of you remember, it was the first time I'd been on a Bima to speak since my bar mitzvah, and I was terribly nervous, and really appropriately nervous to be there. He knew, maybe the synagogue knew better than I did, just how much overlap there was between what I was seeking and the story of the Jewish people and the traditions we hand down generation after generation. The project has been known as Looking for Angola, with Angola being an early 19th century Maroon community on the Manatee River. Maroon communities Maroon is a term used in the Spanish Caribbean for people of African heritage who had been enslaved and found freedom, usually multi-generational freedom. It's actually a proper name in Jamaica, where the Maroons are well known as people living in the mountains, having escaped from enslavement, fought the British Army, and succeeded in their independence. There are Maroons across the islands and the coastal area of the Caribbean and Florida as well, particularly Gulf Coast Florida. And a historian found some traces in the archives of an Maroon community and published it back in 1990. And in 2004, a community scholar decided, well, archaeologists need to find this. And she asked me to be part of it. We made the decision as a research team, really fantastic individuals, to not start just with excavating, not just start with digging, but to start with public presentations, to actually get the community involved. I understood really well that people would not believe, because they couldn't imagine, that there had been an escaped slave community, a Maroon community in what's now Bradenton. And so I wanted to make sure that people were with us. And we started in 2004 with a kickoff event at Sudikoff Auditorium at New College of Florida. Funding from the Florida Humanities Council gave us a chance to talk with a large audience. And one of the things we did as a team was to ask the audience, the community members, what did they want of this project? And they spoke really clearly, make sure you tell the children about this history. And so the first parts of the project were public outreach, tremendous number of presentations. The one I did in 2007 at the synagogue was just one of probably a couple of dozen. And we started doing some excavations. We didn't have much funding. If you think about those years with the Great Recession, there wasn't much possible. But a nonprofit historic preservation organization in Bradenton invited me to come and do some excavations by the Manatee Mineral Spring, provided wonderful support. And so, with new college students and community volunteers, we did some small scale excavations in 2008, 2009, 2013. And I was able to lay out that there were some traces of this ruined community by the Manatee Mineral Spring. 2014, I put my report together. That's what you see here. Submitted it to the state of Florida. Got good critical feedback from colleagues, and people kind of said, "Yep." And I thought at that point I was pretty much done with that project and was looking forward to new challenges. But there was more to do. And so I was part of a team that created interpretive signs for the Manatee Mineral Spring, created a virtual world. This is a digital reconstruction of what I believe Angola looked like. And there was so much interest in this public outreach, this vision of what it looked like, people walking by the signs and learning that under their feet was a really rich history, a rich heritage. And one of those people walking by happened to be a descendant of that maroon community, because the people of Angola who started settling by the Manatee River in the 1770s, a community that was destroyed in 1821. Some of the survivors of a punishing slave raid went to the interior of Florida. Others escaped to the British Bahamas, where they set up a community in Andros Island, particularly Red Bays. And one of the descendants happened to be living in Bradenton, walked by the sign that showed that the descendants had gone to the Bahamas and decided to have a festival bringing the descendants from Red Bays to Bradenton, first in summer of 2018 and then 2019. Wonderful activities. And it led to the National Park Service recognizing that this was a significant location in what they call the Network to Freedom, which most of us would just refer to as the Underground Railroad. And in March of 2019, the Manatee Mineral Spring and my partners at Reflections in Manatee, that nonprofit historic preservation organization, got recognized as part of the Network to Freedom. There's a nice little plaque with that guiding star. That led to the city of Bradenton deciding to expand the Riverwalk, the entertainment district, to the Manatee Mineral Spring. And I had to inform the city managers, city manager and the city commission, that if they're going to expand it, they were going to destroy the archaeological record. And so the city of Bradenton generously provided funding in January of 2020. This is where I was faced with a really interesting challenge. Here's just some photos of my crew at work, really wonderful crew. Most were graduate students from the University of South Florida. This fellow had worked with the artists in Red Bays as a graduate student at the University of Florida. Jason Brown was raised in Miami and went to the U.S. military, lives now in Atlanta, happened to be trained in archaeology. He's one of the descendants of Angola and came to excavate with us the place where his ancestors had found some freedom. But when I was doing this work, I was really just kind of working on a much larger scale than I'd ever done before in Florida. And really the place that I found the most help was the previous experience in Israel. And so I followed some of the guidelines of how to do a large-scale excavation from that previous experience. 20 years of Florida archaeology hadn't provided the right sort of techniques, but that Israeli work ended up being really successful in organizing what ended up being a tremendous amount of dirt being moved, a tremendous amount of materials being recovered from the ground, and what I will end up working on for the next year, tremendous amount of materials that unlock some of the many histories by the Manatee Mineral Spring. The process is not simple. Archaeology is not just the excavating, not just the Indiana Jones, Lara Croft finding of things. There's the research design. The background research was 15 years in developing. We had done the archival research. We had a sense of the stratigraphy. We engaged in those excavations. We found a tremendous amount of materials, did initial cleaning already, but we're going to do much more once the pandemic is over and we get some funds from a grant to engage in the work. We'll be describing, comparing their finds. We'll do some cataloging. Ultimately, we'll work on exhibits for this material as well as adding to the scholarship. And hopefully, in the next few years, you're going to see a whole bunch of materials come out that reveals this really fantastic history of people who had escaped from enslavement, traveled down the Florida Peninsula, having been trained as British soldiers, fought off U.S. military raids, found freedom for a generation by the Manatee Mineral Spring, and even after that haven of freedom was destroyed, the descendants were able to find freedom and liberty over in Andros Island in the Bahamas. The ones who stayed in Florida ended up being part of the Second Seminole War, one of the greatest wars in U.S. history until the Civil War and then the Vietnam War, what is sometimes known as one of the largest slave uprisings because of the significant role of people of African heritage in fighting for their freedom in Florida. The archaeology, well, frankly, I could go on and on about the archaeology and all its details, but that's not really today's presentation. This is a chance to think about what happened in Florida in the early 19th century. And when I first started the project, I was actually a little uncomfortable as a scholar. I didn't really have a good connection between my scholarly work and my Jewish identity. I knew, of course, because every Passover, we would, not during the pandemic, but in normal years, have people come over. Right? And every year, wherever I was, always have a big feast to retell the story of the escape from enslavement in the Nile Valley, the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, crossing of Sinai for 40 years before reaching the land of Canaan, and finding identity, history, and purpose in Eretz Yisrael, and looking at the history for these people of African heritage. We see a story of people enslaved in what's now Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, escaping to Florida, overcoming tremendous challenges and dangers, crossing rivers from the Apalachicola River to the Swanee River to the Manatee River to find liberty on the south side of the Manatee River, where the river itself acted as defense against northern raids from the north. After that, the community was destroyed in 1821, going across the Everglades to what's now Miami, getting help from Cuban fishermen, British naval officers to cross the Florida Straits to the Bahamas, to the British Bahamas, where they found liberty. And it just resonated too much with the Exodus story that I wondered, was this a legend, a myth, or was it history? I was invited before Passover to speak on this in Temple Emanu-El. Several of the churches in Newtown also asked me, and everyone else saw the Exodus story, and I, because of the academic training, was hesitant. But in fact, at this point, I can say it's historically factual, and the combination, the connection is an important one for us to think about, that the flight from freedom, the search for freedom and liberty, is something that inspires, whether it's 3,500 years ago in Egypt or 200 years ago in Florida Gulf Coast. You all hopefully have a sense of what archaeologists have pieced together of going from the land of Goshen through Sinai to Mount Sinai to the wilderness of Zin, and crossing over, down, and then across the river Jordan to Eretz Yisrael, then the land of Canaan. That's what we have here as well. And just like Amalek was a danger in Sinai, these people had escaped first to a fort built by the British at Prospect Bluff back in 1814. That became a rallying point for people seeking freedom and fighting against slavery, both people of African heritage and Native Americans, with support from the British in Spanish La Florida. It's part of the complication of all this history. This was controlled by at least on paper by Spain, although it had no real control over the interior. And hundreds came together. After the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson ordered the U.S. Navy to go up the Apalachicola River, which was a major river for the farmers of Georgia and South Carolina, and attack the fort that was there. And in July of 1816, what the U.S. naval officer said was a lucky shot blew up the fort. 300 were killed in the fort, 200 were captured and taken into enslavement, while hundreds of others escaped to a Seminole village under Billy Bowlegs at Suwanee. They started reconstructing their lives. When Andrew Jackson came down with the Tennessee Volunteers in 1818, and what again the U.S. military tells us, the attack, the Black Warriors, as they're known, held off the U.S. military, those Tennessee Volunteers, and people escaped southward. In the end, the village was destroyed. Where they found liberty was this community that had already been extant at Angola, and probably 750 people ended up going from the south bank of the Manatee River all the way down to where Jungle Gardens is today, spread out in small hamlets, not concentrated together, but spread out as farmers, as people who had horses and cows. And there they lived in peace, reconstructing lives until 1821. Just as Spain handed over Florida to the U.S., another raid came in, destroying. Some went to the interior, some went to what's now Miami, and then over to the British Bahamas. It's an inspiring story. When told well, it moves people. It's something that's useful. People, just as the Exodus story has inspired for generations, this story has been inspiring people who hear it. And they created, and so much of this is so similar. The Exodus story took the Prince of Egypt for a nice image, a different image of people escaping by water with the network to freedom. Thousands of years separated, but it's that notion that people want to live in freedom, creating what in the scholarship we refer to as a maroonage, a place of maroons, a place of people who were maybe escaped slavery, but their children and grandchildren born in freedom, just as the generation was born in Sinai. But I'm a scholar. I'm trained in archaeology, which is a science, and engaged enough in the history and scholarship of the Middle East to know that Mount Sinai is contested, just as the histories for this maroon community is contested, because we don't have much evidence. What we have from my excavations in Bradenton is some traces of that maroon community, but how they get there? What is this model that we've developed to people going down the coast, the accurate one, just as there's all these questions about the Exodus. Did it really happen? Why is there no evidence anywhere in Sinai when Israel controlled Sinai from 1967 to 1982? Archaeologists looked and looked, and archaeologists have been looking for more evidence. There's not much there. And to some extent, it makes sense, right? Because what archaeologists find is not people in motion, particularly people who are escaping something, are not going to leave much trace. They're not going to have much, and what they have, they're going to hold on to. For the Exodus story, Sir Flinders Petrie, back in 1896, found a stela that mentioned the Hebrews, but no mention of the Exodus. But then again, why would the Egyptians mention it? From the U.S. side for this maroon history, this is the image, the drone image of my excavations. You can see the people have a sense of the scale of how much dirt we moved in order to find what was under the ground, and it's been quite significant. We have, from a decade and a half later, 1837 is the first time someone actually documents what's called the territory of Florida for the United States, and does mention that there were some things there, but doesn't really tell of the fight for freedom. And the archaeology is not going to show us freedom. Freedom's abstraction. What archaeology shows is the everyday things people used, or what the powerful marked. If from Egypt, the powerful, the Pharaoh wanted to be known. From here, the everyday things that people used. And there's another piece of this I found really interesting to think about. Although Israel did control Sinai from 1967 to 82, uh, it's now under Egyptian control. And so it's a heritage that's really important for Israel, for the Jewish people, but it's not in Israeli territory. And that extraterritorial national heritage is actually a really interesting concept for globalized notions of heritage. The way we have World Heritage, as constructed by UNESCO for the World Heritage List, is countries put forward what they see as important in their land, in the territory they control, and across the board, countries put forward what's part of what they see as their national heritage. They don't put other people's heritage, even if they control the territory of other people. Well, I've become enmeshed in this history, but the people who care most about this don't live in Florida, though I mentioned two people, but it is just those two people, one in Bradenton and one who lives up in Atlanta, who are descendants who are here. Most live in the Bahamas, in the community of Red Bays, or in Nassau, the capital. And so we're engaging in communication with descendants about their history. They've come back to Angola twice now. They'll come back again, assuming conditions improve in this country in terms of the pandemic. But it's extraterritorial. Most people living in Bradenton, maybe most people listening to me right now, even though I've talked about this and been in newspapers that the synagogue's always happy to share with everyone, it's not our history. And so it may not be something you think about deeply. And so there's also that similarity. And I'm also really clear, and this is what I'll end with. I will be sharing the archaeological evidence, the previous excavations I've published, I've laid out, I've talked about, but they're not very interesting in the way that people expect things to be interesting. Mostly what the Maroons used was mass-produced early 19th century British materials. Found a few other things, but that's most of what we have. Archaeologists, and this is one of our catchphrases, it's not what archaeologists find, it's what we find out. And what I'll leave you with, and for this brief presentation that draws these comparisons, we don't have artifacts from the Exodus. They're just not there. But we do have this heritage that's reproduced every year by millions of people and respected by even more, that tell this story, this very strange story of we were slaves, Avadim Ayinu, and now we are free. And we continue to struggle for our freedom. For the survivors, the descendants of the survivors of Maroon, Florida, living in the Bahamas, they knew their ancestors had come from Florida, but what this research has given is the specificity of where the ancestors or some of the ancestors had lived. And with the Back to Angola Festival, this Junkaroo band was just one of the wonderful dynamics involved of celebrating what is ultimately a sad story of people having to escape from enslavement, having to escape challenges and attacks, only finding liberty in what's now the south side of the Manti River for a few years. But those challenges were met, and the ones who escaped to the Bahamas, well, they've had generations now of living in liberty. And that's what we find, that people hold on to that spirit and that strength of what the ancestors did. And I think the archaeology is very much about exposing that heritage, making it about a specific place and time, and hopefully gaining even more strength from it. So thank you all for listening. I appreciate it, and we'll have some time for question and answers live and in person.